name is Sam Jenks, and welcome to another episode of The Way We Source, a podcast hosted by Kodiak Hub, where we share our talks with procurement practitioners, procure tech leaders, experts, consultants, content gurus, and people that we find downright inspiring, diving into the role that sourcing and procurement plays in the way that we live. If you like today's episode, make sure to rate the program and follow. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting an experienced change leader who has been working in strategic sourcing and supply chain management for close to 20 years' time, bringing background and experience from over 10 years at Ericsson, currently serving as Vice President and Head of Procurement, Aeronautics at Saab, Petra Sjögren. Petra, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you.
And for our listeners out there that don't speak Swedish, we will then refer back to you, Petra Sjögren. Your name isn't quite as interesting to be able to say in English, simply, Petra.
No. True. Usually people speaking English saying Petra, actually. So.
All right, yeah. Understood. Well, we'll keep things to Petra, as you and I both speak Swedish. But Petra, I want to start with a question that we ask a lot of our guests on the show. What exactly does sourcing and procurement mean to you?
That is, I think that's a very good question because it can mean a lot of things. And for me, it's sort of grew on me during all these years working within procurement. But it's actually a part of an organization which I feel is very central and also very connected to all the business end to end, from master data into actually cutting costs on the last line. So I think it's a very broad perspective to work in. So great of impact within the procurement function, I would say.
What is it that you think makes procurement so central? If we just double click on that particular element.
Well, I think it's, just during my years working in procurement and sourcing and supply, it's transformed from maybe being more transactional to actually be part of more business decisions and also understanding the implications of the business that you are in. Of course, this is all depending on what, in what context you are, but it's all connected. And I think that's why it is a central part. It's one of the few functions in an operations where you actually see the consequences of what you're doing very early in development or very early when you're setting up your master data in your business system and so on, through the whole way end to end out to the customer. So for me, that's a central part for an operation.
Yeah, and that value chain perspective is so exciting. And I know the reason why a lot of people love procurement and stay in procurement. And that leads nicely into my next question. I'm thinking kind of what made you decide to work within the procurement role? Did you choose the role or did it choose you?
Well, where do you start? It took a few years before I started to figure out what I wanted to study in the university, and I ended up studying finance and with an industrial touch. So when I was ready, to go job hunting, I came across this job, which was, you're supposed to work with suppliers, you're supposed to work, with orders and all that is connected to getting parts to a factory, basically. So that's where I started, and from that point, I realized that this is a very interesting place to be because you get to work in very broad context. So I worked with external parties, I worked with internal parties and stakeholders. You need to have very good track and understand, everything you do every day has an impact on operational level in the factory. But then I also was introduced to more strategic decisions, such as how do we outsource this in the best way? What suppliers should we choose from, and how do we transfer production to other parts and so on? And then you come across a lot of different functions within the company. So I would say maybe with that background, and then also being explored to many different tasks, I would say I chose to stay within procurement because it's always been very developing.
A fantastic advertisement for the procurement
Yes,
space,
isn't
really,
it?
honestly. Yeah. The procurement industry needs to hire you for that particular segment. That was really well summarized. Everything from really strategic opportunities within the organization to the materiality of a very operational task, right? I think that's why a lot of people love the role, and cool to hear that you had that experience from an entry level to where you are today as VP and head of procurement aeronautics at Saab. Speaking of, Saab and Saab Aeronautics, I'm sure that many of our listeners know who the company Saab is. Better known in the years of the automobile when Saab was still producing, and now focused primarily in the aerospace and defense space. Could you please provide a little bit of a background of kind of what you guys are doing at Saab and Saab Aeronautics?
Sure. So Saab, I mean, Saab is a global company. It's a huge company. Basically, I think we're close to 20,000 employees at this point, and growing. We have four major business areas. One is within surveillance. It's a lot of development and more in surveillance capabilities, I would say. The other one is within naval and the submarines. It's very centric for the submarines. The third one is within ground combat. And I know a lot of people, maybe this is what you see on the news the most, because we support, Sweden is supporting Ukraine with a lot of material, and it's from the ground combat segment. And then you have aeronautics, which is in the air domain. So the fighter system is, of course, huge. It's a huge product and a capability that Sweden wants to have. But it's also other air services supporting other aircrafts, other segments, which is in the air domain. So for aeronautics, I would say the major program is Gripen, but it's also in a much broader context of providing services and so on for different air domain parts.
Fantastically summed up. I'd like to kind of double click on the idea of where you are, the domain you're in today, as it's material to what's going on in the world. And you said it yourself, right? Some of the output of what you guys are purchasing is being directly utilized today in the conflicts that are happening around the world. The way we source as a podcast was started by our team because we're truly fascinated by the role that sourcing and procurement plays in the way that we live. And this is a perfect example, right? Working in the aerospace and defense field, the ramifications of your sourcing can have a really large and lasting impact, in the world around us. I mean, is this something that you and your team talk about openly?
Yes, we do. Since this company is starting to play a different role in society as well, and we truly understand, the impact that we have with the products and so on, but also how important it is from a procurement perspective. It's more like what's important for us. What do we need to understand? So when you're working with this high tech area, which has very long life cycles, you start development maybe 20 years ago, and it's supposed to last for over 30 years in operations. Then, as when
Wow.
working in procurement, you need to understand what are the parameters that you need to understand. What are the roadmaps that you need to understand in some level? So when you're working with the technology, you need to have a broader experience, a broader context that you work in. You need to keep track of things in a more long-term perspective. So we have, in for that segment, we talk a lot about those things like the roadmaps, what's happening, keep track of obsolescence and choices that we make. And then you have other parts where it's more connected to the structure of the aircraft. We buy machinery parts and installation material and so on. And for those material groups, it's more important to understand how you can have a flexibility, how you need to source depending on what's happening maybe in the world and so on. So yes, we do talk about it. It also requires a lot of attention in those areas.
do you reflect ever within the organization or in your team about kind of I'm curious from the social aspect, the geopolitical aspect, or does that ever get discussed? Our products are going directly and have particular ramifications. Is that something that you guys speak about within the organization?
Yes, and I think the industry has maybe been, it's more seen as something that we need this capability, so we are
Right.
supporting the ambition to keep people and society safe, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, so if
Yeah,
you
for sure.
so if you're looking back like this 5 years ago, it was more like, oh, do you really want to work in the war industry? Now it's more, okay, how can we build a safe society? So there's a shift in mindset that we see, and we see it also with the people who wants to join the company and so on. So
Yeah.
yeah, of course we understand what it's for, but it's for another, in another context, I would say.
I think it's, of course, interesting and important to be, self-aware. And it sounds like the Saab business is. And I'm always curious because people come from different areas in different industries and procurement. And, you yourself come from the telecom space before moving into aerospace and defense, two very innovative and technology-driven fields, as you just mentioned. But I'm curious, what's the same and what's different, if you could find likenesses and differences?
Yeah. So yeah, because I've been thinking about that myself. Because telecom industry is very fast moving, and I mean it's
Mm,
very high in R&D and development, and it's very close to maybe IT related questions and areas. So and defense is more technology driven. It's other areas, and it's very long life cycles. So
right.
how the industry is working is very different, I would say. Um, but if you look at procurement, of course, it requires that you need to understand how to keep things for a long term, like a long life cycle
Mm,
in the defense industry. But in the telecom, it's more fast paced. Everything runs very, very fast. So digitalization in every area, and those things are so important because it's very software driven. So I would say maybe that's like the main difference between where you act in procurement and what you need to understand.
right.
But the challenges are often the same, because you have a supply chain that you need to operate in, and you need to understand where you have your risks, and you need to understand what choices you make depending on maybe things as we know now, like the geopolitical situation we have. But before that, we had, there's been other areas to look into. So for COVID, for example, that was something that hit every industry. So in that
Right.
context, we share a lot of challenges, I would say.
Mm. Does the supplier relationships that you experience differ? I'm sure within the area that you're in now, there's it's a more sensitive industry, right? Meaning there's higher regulations, higher need for more strategic relationships rather than transactional relationships. Does that differ from your prior experience to other industries you've been in?
Yes, it does, because I mean, first of all, it's not the same volumes. So you have lower
Right.
volumes, but they are high tech, and they're very integrated in the products. So for that, you need to have a more close relationship to the partners or the suppliers that you choose.
Mm.
For us, it's we have a segmented supply chain, you can say. So we make choices. If you're in a if the supplier is in a segment of a class 1 or class 2 supplier, and we know it's a high risk or it's very integrated, we have a specific model that we work with defined meetings with the agendas, and when and where and how we meet, and for what topics we need to discuss, in order to have a very regular relationship, I would say.
Mm.
Um,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just always very curious, and models are one of the things that our listeners love the most. I'm curious. Would you be willing to share some of the attributes that you define for your segmentation? Like, how does Saab Aeronautics segment their supplier base? I mean, broad strokes. It doesn't need any to be super
No,
specific,
I
but what are
mean,
some of
yeah,
the
sure.
attributes that?
Yes, because you have, I mean, since it's in this industry, everything you want them to be very specific for the needs for your customers in the defense
Sure.
industry. So a lot of times the engineering is very integrated with the products, and then you have like this is a company specific design. Then there is one segment. Then you have things like is more standard. Then that's one segment. And then you can have something that is, we designed it, but we have outsourced it, so it's based on our drawings. That's one segment. And then you have the impact of the sourcing, and like how much spend is it for the end product. So if it's a high spend with a lot of financial contribution to the product, then you need to keep track of different things, and you need to work maybe on a more strategical arena for those parts. Whereas for low value material, where you can basically find more suppliers, it's easier to switch maybe, and so on. There's another strategy for those. So that's how we look at the segmentation when it comes to procurement.
And needing strategic suppliers, you mentioned it, right? Needing a total different relationship with your supplier base. Do you see? I mean, what do you see are some things that have really worked to help Saab come closer to some of those strategic partners? Some concrete tips that you could suggest to other people that are looking to do the same with their strategic suppliers. Some things that you've seen work.
Yeah, I think that's a good question, because it's here it's more if there's an interest for the suppliers to be on a certain platform or design, or if you can co-invest in certain areas, then the interest is of course higher. So it's always like you need to the supplier wants to know what's in it for me, and then the same is for us as a company. What is in it for us to work with you? So if you find a common base and the common roadmaps for that, it's always much easier. But as in any industry, sometimes it's just a decision based on other terms, because we need to be there or we need to be in this area now and so on. But for procurement, I would say it's those elements. If you can find the common roadmaps or how to utilize the technology and work together with design very very close, then you can find beneficial areas for both parties.
Great tip. I'm curious about the space of procurement and sourcing in the defense area, and we've talked a bit about it already. But if we double click on that particular element, and based, of course, on the current, and very recent geopolitical climate, have you seen the role of procurement in the defense area shift in any ways, and if so, how?
I think in the defense, it's more the role of procurement and what we can contribute with, since we have this changing climate and changing environment, working with that all the time. So I would say it's of higher interest to understand how the supply chain is behaving, and where we have the risks in supply chain, and how we can contribute with that element, like propose things like we need to source more material in this segment, or maybe we need to understand that this supplier is not healthy enough based on these conditions, and so on. And in this industry, we also have a lot of sanctions that we need to play an active role in, and define and set the scene for on how to act with the supply chain. So in some areas, we had to find new suppliers, basically. So that's a big contribution when it comes to defense, because it's very connected to the geopolitical area, and also the investments that countries do in defense these days.
Do you think that there's anything in particular that you and your team do well that you would suggest to others in the space, whether it's defense or alike, to be able to get ahead of some of these risks and alike?
Yes, I think just keep monitoring, keep close to the supply chain. And one thing that I often talk about is we can actually use our suppliers, because they have so much information, because we have them all over the world, and they can contribute for us to understand how things are changing in their environment. So use the information from your supply chain, I would say, and work very close to them because they have so much knowledge and information. So instead of maybe being 50 people working in procurement, you have maybe 200 suppliers that have so much expertise and the knowledge of their supply chain and analytics and what's happening in their environment. So use them. I think that's maybe the best advice that we have been using in these sensitive areas.
Yeah, that's a great bit of advice. And getting closer to the pulse of the supply chain is something that I know a lot of teams want and need to do more of. But it's challenging as well in a increasingly global context. I'm curious. You're a big proponent of change. It says so even in your LinkedIn profile. What is one thing that you think needs to change within the procurement role and/or industry, whether it's in defense or just generally speaking?
Yeah, so I think maybe the change is we can play a more active role in the company. So we have so much information, like I said, like from end to end perspective, knowing that from the master data into how we affect maybe the cost picture of the end product and so on. So try to get the agenda on the table and set a strategy and work with on how you want to contribute to the business you're in. So and also try to understand how you can benefit from other industries. If you've been working in another industry, there's always something you can bring back and connect to where you are.
That's great tips. What's one thing that maybe now today, with 20 years of experience behind you, that you wish that you knew at the start of your career?
Oh yeah, but I mean, if you look at procurement, it's maybe I realized that the things I learned 20 years ago, I still have advantage of in everything I do. So and that's kind of comforting to know that even though if you're just in the beginning of your career, you will have so many useful insights and you will be in so many contexts that you will actually bring value in moving forward. And then maybe from a self leadership perspective, just trust yourself, trust your instinct, go with heart and brain. I think maybe that's the best advice.
That's great. Lead with self leadership and also not to take experiences for granted. It's really good advice. Very good
Yes.
advice. We'd like to come in then to our last part of the segment that we do in the way we source, which is a bit of a quick fire. You might remember Kodak, the famous photography company, had what they called their Kodak moment, which was a moment captured in time. We're going to capture a moment in time here with our Kodiak moment. It's a quick fire round, just a few questions to be able to get to know Petra Sjögren, the person, potentially a little bit more than the VP and head of procurement of Aeronautics at Saab. You ready for the quick fire then, Petra?
Sure, fire away.
All right, sounds good. And please answer with one word and/or one sentence to the questions. One book that you would recommend to our listeners right now, or a podcast potentially that you're listening to, or you would like to be able to recommend.
Yeah, maybe if, going from good to great. That's one of the books. I know I studied it early in the career, and it has some great tips on how to make an impact. I would say that's probably the one book.
That's super. That's super. I myself am a big fan of LPs, and it's kind of made this resurgence to be able to listen to full albums front to back. I was just listening yesterday to one of my favorite albums. If you were going to pick out one of your favorite albums or a favorite artist, who would you pick out to be able to put on to an LP machine?
Oh my goodness. Maybe it's something from the 80s, or maybe something like soft jazz or something. I eat everything when it comes to music. So so but something very very
Okay.
smooth and nice.
If you had to choose one artist or one band, then
Probably something with Coldplay. It's it works for everyone.
Very nice. Very nice. And in Sweden that we have what we call our paradrätt, right? You come over to mine, I'd be making you my paradrätt, maybe of carbonara or chicken cacciatore or spaghetti and meatballs, my grandmother's recipes. If I were to come over to Petra Sjögren, so the house of Sjögren, what would I be getting served as a paradrätt?
Yes. So I would probably serve, spaghetti with seafood, basically. Pasta linguine with blue mussels and shrimps based on a tomato sauce and really nice white.
Very nice. Well, the dish sounds nice. The wine sounds like a plus on top of it. So it sounds like a lovely time at the household Sjögren. Thank you so much, Petra, for taking the time to be able to be on today's episode. If people want to reach out or get in touch with you or understand what you got going on in your life, how could they be able to reach out?
Oh, you can reach me through either the LinkedIn profile, I would say maybe is the best way to connect.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you again so much for your time on today's episode.
Thank you, Sam.